They tell me I've lost my mind, that the horrors I witnessed were too much for any man to bear. They don't know the half of it. They don't know the darkness that lingers in every corner of my soul, whispering my sins back to me in the dead of night. My name is Marcus Holloway, and I used to be a detective in Ashwood, Oregon. Used to be, because now I'm just a shell of a man, trapped in this sterile white room with nothing but my thought, and they're anything but safe. The beginning of the end started 6 months ago when we found the first body. A young woman, no older than 25, lying in the woods just outside town. Her eyes were gone, the sockets hollow and black as the night sky, and in her hand, clenched so tight it took 3 men to pry it open, was a single black feather. I've seen my fair share of death. There was something different about that. Something personal. Felt like the killer had left a message, and it was meant for me. But that's crazy, right? Just the paranoia of a man who spent too many years staring into the abyss. At least that's what I tried to tell myself. The next few weeks were a blur of fear and frustration. More bodies, all with the same grotesque signature. Missing eyes, black feathers. The town was on edge, and so was I. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty sockets, staring at me, choosing me. It was around that time that the shadows started following me. First, I thought it was just the stress, the lack of sleep. But then I began to notice them everywhere, lingering just out of sight, flickering in the corner of my vision. And the whispers, odd whispers, they would start just as I was drifting off to sleep, voices I didn't recognize, hissing things I couldn't understand. But one word stood out every time: guilty. I began to question everything, even my own sanity. I started drinking more, sleeping less, poring over the case files until my eyes bled. But the more I searched, the less sense it made. How could a man like me, a man dedicated to justice, be connected to something so vile? Then I found the first feather in my own home. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I was in my office, surrounded by papers and photographs, trying to piece together the puzzle, and I saw it, lying on my desk, as if it had been there the whole time. Black, sleek, and deadly, just like the others. I could barely breathe. My hands shook as I reached for it, half expecting it to dissolve into nothing, a figment of my frayed mind. But it was real, solid, and that's when the voices grew louder, echoing off the walls, drowning out my own thoughts. Guilty, guilty. No, it couldn't be. Someone was playing a sick game with me, trying to break me down, to drive me insane. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Deep down, I knew the truth was much worse. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, those empty sockets, damn feather. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself that it was just stress, that someone was trying to mess with me. But the whispers wouldn't stop. Everywhere I went, they followed. The precinct, in my car, even in my own home. Guilty, guilty. I could hear them in the wind, in the rustling of leaves, in the creaking of floorboards. And the shadows, those cursed shadows, grew bolder, no longer content to just linger in the corners of my vision. Now they moved. I'd catch them slithering along the walls, creeping across the floor, and every time I turned to face them, they'd disappear, leaving me questioning my own sanity. I started seeing things that couldn't be real. Faces in the mirror that weren't mine, bloodstains on my hands that vanished when I blinked. Once, I found a pair of eyes, real human eyes, staring back at me from the sink. I blinked, and they were gone, replaced by the empty sockets of my reflection. By then, I was barely functioning. I knew I was losing it, but I couldn't stop. Case had consumed me. I spent every waking moment hunting for answers, but the more I searched, the more the evidence pointed back at me. I found notes in my own handwriting detailing the murders, things only the killer could know. There were photos, too, horrific images of the victims, with my shadow looming over them. Didn't make any sense. I had no memory of taking those pictures, no memory of writing those notes, but the proof was there, right in front of me. Couldn't escape it. And then there were the clothes. It was a Sunday night when I found them. I was digging through my closet, desperate to find something, anything that would prove I wasn't going insane. And there they were, shoved into the back, a blood-stained shirt and a pair of muddy boots. The same mud we'd found at one of the crime scenes. I dropped them like they were on fire, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. I tried to remember what I'd done that night, but it was all a blur. The whiskey, the pills, maybe I'd blacked out? Maybe, but no, there was something else. Something darker, clawing at the edges of my mind. Guilty, guilty. The whispers were louder now, echoing in my skull, filling my brain with static. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, my head spinning, and that's when I saw it, written in blood on the wall. Not over. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those words. Felt like hours, maybe days. But when I finally moved, it was like someone else was controlling my body. My hands reached for my phone, and before I knew it, I was dialing a number I'd hoped I'd never have to call. 911, what's your emergency? My voice was a whisper, barely audible. I think I killed them, all of them. There was a pause on the other end, then the operator's voice. Calm and steady. Sir, where are you? Couldn't answer. My eyes were glued to the wall, to the blood that was still dripping from those cursed words. I could hear the sirens in the distance, getting closer, but they didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. Because I knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. The shadows were closing in, and this time I knew they wouldn't disappear. Not until they took everything from me. The moment they arrived, I knew it was over. Flashing red and blue lights turned my home into a hellish landscape, the shadows twisting and writhing in the chaotic glow. I could hear the officers shouting my name, banging on the door, but their voices sounded distant, muffled, as if I was underwater, drowning in the darkness that surrounded me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the mirror across the room, where I saw my reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't me, not really. The man in the mirror had my face, but his eyes were empty, void of any humanity. And he was smiling, twisted, cruel smile that sent a shiver down my spine. Open the door, Marcus, one of the officers yelled, his voice barely breaking through the haze. But the man in the mirror just kept smiling as if he knew something I didn't. Guilty, guilty. The whispers were a roar now, filling my head, shaking my very bones. Couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing thick and heavy, choking me. And then, in a moment of clarity, I realized what I had to do. The only way to end this nightmare, to stop the whispers, was to confront the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the mirror, my reflection's eyes following me. A sick smile, never wavering. My hands were trembling as I reached out, touching the cold glass, and that's when I felt it. Pulse, faint but unmistakable, as if the mirror was alive, breathing in sync with me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't look away. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the glass, and whispered, "Who are you?" The man in the mirror didn't answer. Instead, his smile grew wider, splitting his face in two. And then, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, he said, "I am you, Marcus. I've always been you." I stumbled back, horror gripping my heart. No, this wasn't real. Couldn't be. But the evidence was right there, staring me in the face. All the pieces were falling into place. The blackouts, the missing time, the blood on my hands. It was me. I was the killer. But how? How could I do such monstrous things? My reflection tilted its head as if reading my thoughts. You created me, Marcus. Out of your fear, your pain. I was born the night you first held a dying man in your arms, watching the life drain from his eyes. I grew stronger with every case, every corpse you found, every night you spent staring into the abyss. You couldn't handle the darkness, so you gave it to me. Now I'm all that's left. No, I whispered, backing away. You're lying. But I knew it wasn't a lie. The truth was staring me right in the face, and it was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. I wasn't just investigating the murders, I was committing them. And all this time, I'd been chasing myself, spiraling deeper into madness. The banging on the door grew louder, more frantic, but it was drowned out by the blood rushing in my ears, by the reflection's voice echoing in my skull. You can't escape me, Marcus. I am you. I am your true self. Room spun, the walls closing in, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The mirror shattered, pieces raining down around me, but the voice, it didn't stop. Guilty. Guilty. The door burst open, the officers flooding in, their guns drawn, their voices sharp with panic. They didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. I was lost, drowning in the dark abyss of my own mind, the truth suffocating me. As they dragged me away, I caught one last glimpse of the shattered mirror, of the man in the shards grinning back at me, triumphant. And in that moment, I knew there was no escaping him. He was me, and I was him. We were one. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of my own laughter. Cold, hollow, and utterly insane. They told me the truth, piece by piece, like shrapnel being driven into my skull. The bodies they found buried in shallow graves, the notes written in blood, the grotesque rituals carried out in the dead of night. They showed me the photos, images of women mutilated and posed like broken dolls, their lifeless eyes replaced by dark voids. And the feathers, always the black feathers, marking each victim as mine. Each revelation was like a hammer blow, shattering the fragile remnants of my sanity. How could I have done these things? How could I have become this monster? But the evidence was undeniable. They found the knife in my home, stained with blood that matched the victims. They traced my footsteps to every crime scene, matched my fingerprints to the smudges left on their skin. I was the killer. There was no escaping it. But it wasn't me. Not the me I knew. It was him. The other Marcus. The one I created out of fear and pain. The one who reveled in the darkness while I tried to stay in the light. I could feel him now, lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. The doctor said it was dissociative identity disorder, that the trauma of my work had fractured my mind, splitting me into two. One side fought for justice, the other fed on horror. And as the killings escalated, so did his control, until I was nothing more than a passenger in my own body, watching helplessly as he carried out his gruesome work. They locked me away after that, deep inside the walls of Ashwood Asylum. The room was small, cold, and suffocatingly white, a stark contrast to the darkness festering inside me. The voices were quieter now, but they never truly went away. They whispered to me in the dead of night, reminding me of the things I'd done, the lives I'd taken. Guilty, guilty. They chanted like a twisted lullaby. The days blurred together, a haze of medication and therapy sessions that did nothing to silence the storm raging in my mind. I tried to remember who I was before all this, but the memories were like shadows slipping through my fingers every time I reached for them. And then came the final revelation, the one that broke me completely. It was a quiet afternoon when the doctors brought me a visitor. I hadn't seen anyone from the outside in months, so when they told me someone had come to see me, my heart leapt with a strange mix of hope and dread. They led me into a small, sterile room with a single table and 2 chairs. On the other side of the glass, I saw her, a woman pale and gaunt with dark circles under her eyes. She looked familiar, but it took me a moment to place her, and then it hit me like a ton of bricks. She was one of the victims. I couldn't breathe. How was she here? I'd seen her body mutilated and left for dead, her eyes gouged out, her hands clutching that cursed feather. She couldn't be alive. But there she was, staring at me with a look of such intense hatred that it made my skin crawl. "Do you remember me, Marcus?" she asked, her voice like ice. "Do you remember what you did to me?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move. All I could do was stare, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of it all. This was impossible. She was supposed to be dead. No, I had killed her. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You thought you could bury me, didn't you? You thought you could bury all of us, but we're still here, Marcus. We'll always be here. You can't escape us. Not now, not ever." And then she smiled. Smile so twisted, so filled with malice, that it made my blood run cold. The same smile I'd seen in the mirror that night. The same smile I'd seen in my reflection as I butchered those poor women. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the room, through the walls, through the very core of my being. The guards rushed in, restraining me, dragging me back to my cell. But all I could see was her face, her eyes. Those empty, hollow eyes burned into my mind. They told me later that there was no visitor, that I'd imagined the whole thing, a hallucination brought on by stress and guilt. I knew the truth. She was real. They were all real. The women I'd killed, the lives I'd destroyed, they were coming back for me, one by one, to drag me down to the darkness where I belonged. Now I sit here, in this cold, empty room, waiting for the inevitable. The voices are louder now, more insistent. their whispers growing into a deafening roar. The shadows dance on the walls, taking shapes I don't want to recognize. And in the mirror I see him, my reflection, smiling back at me with those dead, hollow eyes. I know what's coming. I know I can't escape it. The darkness is closing in, and soon it will swallow me whole. But the worst part that keeps me awake at night, that fills my soul with a terror I can't even begin to describe, I'm not sure I want to escape, because deep down, in the darkest corners of my mind, I know that he's still there. The other Marcus. And part of me, God help me, wants him to come back. Maybe he never left. I knew something was wrong the moment I crossed the town line into Fairview. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, filling my lungs with a damp, bold dread. I tried to shake it off as I drove past the rows of old, sagging houses, but the feeling clung to me like a bad memory. Fairview was supposed to be just another quiet, out-of-the-way town in Massachusetts, but as I drove through the empty streets, I couldn't help but notice how unnervingly still everything was. No kids playing, no cars driving by, just an oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I'd been a detective in Boston for over a decade, seen my share of gruesome crime scenes and deranged criminals, but this place was different. Call came in last week. Local cops in Fairview had a situation they couldn't handle. A string of murders, bodies mutilated in ways that didn't make sense, symbols carved into the skin like some twisted piece of art. They needed help, and I was the guy they called. As I pulled up to the old police station, a small brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 50s, I felt the unease in my gut tighten. The air here was thick with an unspoken fear. Inside, the officers looked as worn out as the station itself. Their eyes were hollow, and there was an edge to their voices, like they'd been dealing with something far beyond their training. Sheriff Taylor, a man in his late 50s with a face as lined as the town's streets, greeted me with a firm handshake. His grip was strong, but his hand was cold. He led me into his office, where a large map of Fairview was pinned to the wall, red dots marking the locations of each murder. "We've never seen anything like this, Detective Mason," Taylor said, voice low and gravelly. "Folks around here are scared out of their minds. I don't blame them." He handed me a folder, the contents spilling out in a mess of photos and reports. First picture I saw made my stomach churn. A young woman barely in her 20s, her body contorted in a way that seemed almost inhuman. Her skin pale and cold. The symbols carved into her flesh were precise, methodical, but their meaning eluded me. I'd seen plenty of strange things on the job, but this was something else. "What do the witnesses say?" I asked, flipping through the grim collection of images. Taylor hesitated, his eyes flickering to the window, checking to see if someone or something was listening. "They talk about a shadow, Detective. Figure that shouldn't be there. Watching, waiting. I don't put much stock in ghost stories, but the way these people talk about it, it's like they've seen the devil himself." I bit back a laugh. The sheriff's serious expression made me think twice. I'd always prided myself on being a man of logic, but the fear in his voice was hard to ignore. "Look, I'm here to catch whoever's doing this," I said, more to myself than to him. "Whether it's a flesh and blood killer or whatever these people think it is, I'll find them." But even as I said the words, I felt the weight of the task ahead sinking in. Something about this place was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me too. I pushed the thought aside and got to work. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't just another case. Something dark had taken root in Fairview, and it was only a matter of time before it found me. I started with the crime scenes. In my experience, they always told a story, sometimes one more truthful than the people involved. Fairview was no different, or so I thought. The first scene was a house on Elm Street, an old Victorian with peeling paint and windows that stared out like dead eyes. The victim, Emily Carter, had been found in her living room. The sheriff's report said it was one of the worst they'd seen, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality. As I stepped inside, the air was thick, stale, like the house had been holding its breath since the night of the murder. The furniture was covered in a fine layer of dust, untouched, except for the dark stains on the carpet where Emily had been found. I tried to focus on the details, the blood splatter, the way the furniture was positioned. Something else demanded my attention. Creeping unease settled over me. I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows, from the corners of the room where the light didn't quite reach. I shook off the feeling and moved toward the spot where her body had been. The symbols. They were crude, carved into the hardwood floor beneath where she lay. I crouched down to examine them, my breath hitching as I traced the lines with my gloved hand. They didn't make sense, neither letters nor symbols I recognized, but they stirred something deep within me, a primal fear I couldn't explain. As I rose, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering just beyond the threshold of the room. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing, just the empty doorway leading into the hallway. "Get a grip, John," I muttered to myself, forcing my pulse to slow. But the unease lingered, cold knot in my gut. I spent hours combing through the house, every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind setting me on edge. Each room felt more oppressive than the last, like the house itself was trying to push me out, protect its secret. By the time I left, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, sinister shadows across the town. I could feel the eyes on me again, watching as I walked back to my car. The second scene was worse. It was an abandoned church on the outskirts of Fairview, long forgotten by time. The locals called it St. Michael's, but it hadn't been a place of worship for decades. Now it was a husk, crumbling and empty. Perfect place for something unspeakable to happen. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, their creak echoing through the empty space like a dying breath. The inside was cold, colder than it should have been, and the air smelled of damp rot and something else. Something acrid that stung my nose and brought bile to my throat. The victim here was David Wright, a local mechanic. His body had been found on the altar, spread out like an offering. The sight made my skin crawl, his eyes wide open, mouth twisted in a scream that would never end. And those damn symbols again, carved into his chest this time, as if to mock the sanctity of the place. As I stood there staring at the grotesque scene, a low whisper broke the silence. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. I turned, searching the empty pews, found nothing. The whispering continued, growing into a chorus of voices, faint, indistinct, yet filled with a chilling urgency. I gripped my flashlight tighter, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it only served to deepen the shadows. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls in a maddening symphony. My pulse quickened, sweat beating on my forehead. I knew I should leave, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, as if something was holding me there, demanding I listen. Suddenly the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the voices had been. It was as if the church itself was waiting, expecting something. Then I saw it. Figure, dark and indistinct, standing at the far end of the nave, where the light barely touched. My breath caught in my throat. It was watching me, I was sure of it. My body locked up, every muscle screaming to move, but I couldn't. All I could do was stare as the shadowy figure began to shift, almost gliding toward me. Panic surged through me, breaking whatever hold had frozen me in place. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I fled the church, slamming the door behind me. My heart thundered in my chest as I leaned against my car, gasping for breath. I told myself it was just the stress, the exhaustion getting to me, but deep down I knew there was something more. Something in Fairview was terribly, horribly wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows in my motel room seemed to stretch longer than they should, pooling in the corners like ink. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, its presence looming over me, filling me with an all-consuming dread. The whispers returned, too, faint at first, but growing louder until they filled my head with their insidious chanting. I found myself staring at the ceiling, wide-eyed, as the hours ticked by. The line between waking and dreaming began to blur, and I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I knew then that whatever had happened in Fairview had started to take its toll on me. My mind, once sharp and rational, was unraveling, thread by thread, pulled apart by the darkness that seemed to cling to this town. In the early hours of the morning, just as sleep was finally beginning to claim me, I heard it again. A whisper, close this time, right next to my ear. I shot up in bed, heart hammering, but the room was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to be watching, waiting. Sleep became a distant memory. The whispers, the shadows, they were constant now, relentless in their pursuit. Every time I closed my eyes, they were there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I knew I was losing grip, that slipping into a darkness that I might never escape. But I couldn't stop, not when I was so close to the truth. The next morning, I decided to visit the local library, hoping to dig up anything that might explain the strange symbols and the town's history. The librarian, a frail old woman with a face etched in permanent worry lines, seemed reluctant to help. Her eyes darted nervously around the room as if afraid something might be listening. "You're looking for things best left forgotten," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Fairview has a past, Mr. Mason. Dark one." I pressed her for more, and after what felt like an eternity, she finally led me to a dusty corner of the library, where old records and journals were kept, documents that no one had touched in years. "Be careful," she warned, voice trembling. "Some doors once opened can never be closed." As she shuffled away, I began to sift through the yellowed pages, my fingers trembling with a mix of anticipation and dread. Didn't take long to find what I was looking for. An old leather-bound journal, pages brittle with age, caught my eye. The name on the cover sent a chill down my spine. The Order of the Black Thorn. The entries inside were filled with ramblings about rituals, dark entities, and a secret society that had thrived in Fairview centuries ago. The townspeople had once worshipped something ancient and malevolent, hidden away in the shadows. The symbols I'd seen carved into the victims' bodies were all there, scrawled in ink, alongside detailed descriptions of a ritual to summon a being from another realm. A shadow. My blood ran cold as I read the final entry. Spoke of an unfinished ritual, one that required a final sacrifice to be complete. The ritual had been disrupted but not destroyed. The entity was bound to the town, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to break free. And that moment was now. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Room seemed to close in on me, the shadows on the walls twisting and warping as if alive. I needed to get out, to breathe, but as I turned to leave, I saw it again. A figure standing in the corner, cloaked in darkness, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence boring into me, piercing through my very soul. It wasn't just watching me. It was inside my head, whispering thoughts that weren't my own, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread and despair. I bolted from the library, the old woman's warning echoing in my mind. The sunlight outside did nothing to warm me. It was as if the darkness of Fairview had seeped into my bones, chilling me to the core. The whispers grew louder, their words indecipherable, filled with a terrifying urgency. I could feel the town closing in around me, suffocating me with its ancient secrets and malevolent history. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I decided to visit the last remaining member of the Wright family, an elderly woman named Margaret, who lived on the outskirts of town. David Wright had been her grandson, and I hoped she might shed some light on what had happened to him. Margaret's house was old and isolated, surrounded by a thick forest that seemed to swallow the light. When I knocked on the door, it creaked open on its own, revealing a darkened interior that smelled of decay and rot. I hesitated, but the need for answers pushed me inside. Margaret was sitting in a rocking chair by the fireplace, her back to me. The fire was out, the hearth cold, but she rocked slowly, rhythmically, as if in a trance. The room was filled with old photographs, each one turned face down as if the images were too terrible to look at. "Mrs. Wright?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. I approached her cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. As I got closer, I realized she was muttering something under her breath. A continuous chant that sent shivers down my spine. "Mrs. Wright," I tried again, this time placing a hand on her shoulder. She froze, rocking chair coming to an abrupt stop. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me, and I felt my blood turn to ice. Her eyes were vacant, hollowed out like two black voids, and her skin was stretched tight over her bones, as if she hadn't eaten in weeks. "It's too late," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "He's coming for you." Before I could react, she slumped forward, lifeless, her body collapsing into a heap of brittle bones and sagging flesh. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer, more sinister, as if they were reaching for me. I stumbled back, panic flooding my veins. I had to get out, had to escape this nightmare before it consumed me whole. But as I turned to flee, the front door slammed shut, wrapping me inside with the darkness that had overtaken Margaret's home. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were all around me, filling the room with their maddening chant. The shadows writhed and twisted, taking on shapes that defied reason, figures that shouldn't exist in this world. I was losing it. I knew that much. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred to the point where I couldn't tell which was which anymore. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to find a way out. And then I saw it. The shadowy figure from before, standing in the doorway, blocking my escape, was closer now, more defined, its features twisted into a grotesque mockery of a human face. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, locking onto mine with an intensity that made me want to scream. Moved toward me, slow and deliberate, each step bringing with it a wave of suffocating dread. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room was closing in on me, the walls themselves seeming to bend and warp as the figure advanced. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The figure didn't stop. It was relentless, inevitable, like the darkness itself. Just as it was upon me, I felt a cold hand clamp down on my shoulder, pulling me back into the shadows. My vision blurred, world spinning around me as I was dragged deeper into the house, into the very heart of the darkness that had taken hold of Fairview. The last thing I saw before the shadows consumed me was the figure's face, twisted into a smile that promised nothing but pain and despair. I woke in darkness. Cold, damp earth pressed against my cheek, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. My head throbbed with pain, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. But then it all came flooding back. The library, Margaret, the shadow. I was still in Fairview, still trapped in this nightmare that refused to end. Slowly I pushed myself to my feet, my body aching as if I'd been hit by a truck. I was in some kind of underground chamber, the walls rough and uneven, carved out of the earth itself. Faint light seeped in from cracks above, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed along the walls. And then I heard it, the whispering. It was soft at first, barely more than a breath against my ear, but it grew louder, filling the chamber with its insidious presence. The words were still indecipherable, twisted language that made my skin crawl, but I could feel their intent. They wanted me to give in, to let go of whatever sanity I had left. I wasn't sure how long I'd been unconscious, but I knew time was running out. I had to find a way out of this place before the shadow found me again. At every corner I turned, every path I took, seemed to lead me deeper into the labyrinth. It was as if the chamber was alive, shifting and changing to keep me trapped. As I stumbled through the dark, I came across an old stone altar in the center of the chamber. It was covered in the same symbols I'd seen carved into the victims, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. And there, lying on the altar, was a leather-bound book, the same journal I'd found in the library. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. I didn't want to touch it, but something compelled me, force I couldn't resist. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, the whispers stopped, and a suffocating silence fell over the chamber. I opened the book, and the pages turned on their own, stopping at a passage I hadn't seen before. The text was in that same twisted language, but somehow I understood. It was a ritual, final step to seal the shadow and end its reign of terror. But the cost was unimaginable. A life for a life. The shadow was bound to this town by blood, and only blood could release it. I looked around, the walls pressing in on me, the air growing colder with each passing second. The truth hit me like a freight train. The ritual wasn't unfinished. It was waiting for me. I was the last piece of the puzzle, the final sacrifice needed to banish the shadow. But as the realization settled in, something else clicked into place. The shadow wasn't just bound to Fairview. It was bound to me. It had been following me, taunting me, dragging me deeper into this nightmare because it needed me to complete the ritual. But what it didn't realize was that I still had a choice, a way to fight back. I tore the journal in half, ripping out the pages with the ritual and throwing them into the darkness. The whispers returned, angrier now, filled with a rage that reverberated through my skull. The chamber trembled, the walls shaking as the shadow manifested before me. A mass of writhing darkness that blotted out the light, lunged at me, cold tendrils wrapping around my limbs, pulling me toward the altar. My breath hitched as I struggled against it, but the force was too strong, dragging me down, deeper into the earth. The darkness closed in around me, the air growing thick with the stench of death. In my final moments, as the shadow's grip tightened, I remembered something Margaret had said. "He's coming for you." She wasn't just warning me about the shadow, she was telling me that it couldn't win unless I let it. And I wasn't going to give it that satisfaction. With every ounce of strength I had left, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the old lighter I'd carried for years, a relic from my days in Boston. The shadow recoiled as I flicked it open, a small flame casting a warm, golden light, cut through the darkness. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the roar of the shadow. "Not today." I dropped the lighter onto the pages scattered across the altar, and the dry paper caught instantly. Flames roared to life, illuminating the chamber with a fierce, blinding light. The shadow shrieked, its form unraveling as it tried to escape the fire's wrath, but it was too late. The fire consumed everything. Book, altar, the symbols. The chamber shook violently as the shadow's form dissolved into the air, its screams echoing through the void, before finally fading into silence. I felt the tendrils release their grip, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the flames died down to embers. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a town waiting, watching to see what would happen next. I knew I hadn't destroyed the shadow. Not completely. It was still out there, lurking in the darkness, bound to me by a thread so thin it was almost invisible. But I'd weakened it, forced it back into whatever hell it had come from. For now, I climbed out of the chamber, emerging into the cool night air. The town was still, the streets empty, as if Fairview itself was holding its breath. I stood there for a moment, letting the breeze wash over me, the whispers finally gone. But the unease remained, a deep, gnawing fear, would never leave. I didn't go back to Boston. How could I? Fairview had marked me, changed me in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. I became a ghost, wandering from town to town, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the day the shadow would return. And I knew it would. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. Decant.